would be honored if you would join us.
Hello and welcome to Film Stories. In today's episode, with J.K. Rowling's Wizarding Worlds still going strong on the big screen, we're going to take a look at a pivotal film in the Harry Potter series. Released in 2007, Harry Potter and the Order of the Phoenix is really a turning point in that whole franchise, that whole huge endeavour of making 8 movies in the course of 10 years, all based on one long-running saga that was still not entirely published at the time it started. It's easily, inarguably, a forebear to the Marvel Cinematic Universe and the kind of interconnected franchise storytelling we get in films these days. But the reason why Order of the Phoenix is such a landmark is partly for drafting in a director who would bring an end to the chop and change of previous installments and stick with it until the finale, but also, interestingly, in how the film was a massive success that still reportedly made a loss for Warner Brothers. So from pre-production to its reception, that's what we're going to be looking at in today's story. But let's start by looking back at the book on which the film was based. When it was published in 2003, Harry Potter and the Order of the Phoenix was eagerly anticipated by fans. It had been 3 years since the last book was published, and weighing in at more than 250,000 words, it was and remains the longest volume of the entire series. It was also the first book to be published after the film franchise had begun, and it wasn't for the first time that Warner was mulling whether or not such an unwieldy tome would be better served as 2 films rather than 1. They had also gone down this road with Goblet of Fire, and likewise decided with Order of the Phoenix to make 1 film when the time came. While the films are, as a rule, extremely reverent to Rowling's source material, especially by blockbuster standards, this meant they had to get highly creative with the adaptation in order to fit everything in. And on top of that, as well as looking for a director who would follow in the footsteps of Chris Columbus, Alfonso Cuarón, and most recently Mike Newell, the producers faced the challenge of finding someone to step in for regular screenwriter Steve Kloves. Kloves wrote all of the other films in the franchise but was unavailable for this critical turning point. For those unfamiliar, Order of the Phoenix picks up where the previous film left off, with Daniel Radcliffe's Harry contemplating the return of the evil Lord Voldemort, but discovering resistance to his version of events of Voldemort's return in the press and from the highest levels of government. It's essentially a school kid going up against spin doctors and a government that is burying its head in the sand. By nature, it's a more political story, and it's the point in the series at which things become more driven by continuity. If, say, you wanted to go out to the multiplex and watch any of the first 4 films in the series on a standalone basis as they came out, that wouldn't be impossible. But at this point in the series, we see a definite shift towards the ongoing storyline, laying the groundwork for the cinematic universe model that's more commonplace today. So, on the director front, Warner Brothers had a few names in mind. At first, it was rumoured that the studio was calling M. Night Shyamalan, who was in the process of making Lady in the Water for them, and that they also wanted him to write the screenplay. That didn't come to pass, but we do know that the studio offered it to Guillermo del Toro, Jean-Pierre Jeunet, and Mira Nair, most intriguingly, all 3 of whom turned down the film because they felt they would be constricted on a 10-part film of this kind, looking at the previous films in the franchise. Even more intriguingly, Matthew Vaughn declined an offer because he was set on making the brilliant Stardust at that point, which ultimately came out a few months after Order of the Phoenix would. In the end, producer David Heyman reached out to David Yates, whose TV work included political dramas like State of Play and The Girl in the Cafe. With the more political angle of this story in the series, Yates was considered ideal to handle that tone, so he was offered and he accepted and was confirmed to be directing the film in November 2004. That was when that decision was announced. And it was with the help of screenwriter Michael Goldenberg, who had been in the running to write the very first Potter film, Philosopher's Stone, that Yates turned the longest book in the series into the shortest film up to that point. These had all been long films up to this point, and clocking in at a relatively deft 138 minutes. The finished film version of Order of the Phoenix goes to impressive lengths to condense Rowling's plot down into a really streamlined film adaptation. However, costing $150 million, it was also the most expensive film in the series up to this point, and that's partly as a result of contracts. These films have a huge recurring cast ranging from the three leads, Daniel Radcliffe, Rupert Grint and Emma Watson, to all of the Hogwarts faculty members like Robbie Coltrane, Maggie Smith and Alan Rickman, all of whom had completed their 4-film contract with Goblet of Fire. Which meant that going into this one, the studio had to renegotiate deals with all of the principals who had been in this series since the first film. It was also at this point that all three of the young leads had a bit of a wobble. They were all turning 16, 17. They were due to complete their GCSEs and A-levels at the point when Order of the Phoenix would be filming. And on the verge of leaving school, it's understandable that anyone would have reservations about continuing on as the world's most famous school children. Rupert Grint and Emma Watson have both spoken in recent interviews about this, and Daniel Radcliffe was also interested in branching out into other roles. Ultimately, around the time that Order of the Phoenix was released in cinemas, Radcliffe was performing on stage in the lead role of Peter Schaffer's Equus, which marked him as a serious actor outside of Hogwarts stuff. Eventually, they all agreed to see out the series, and frankly, it's all the better for it. In a series that's bursting with special effects sequences, the most impressive effect is watching the three leads grow up in real time. So, filming started in 2006 in February and ran to the end of that year with a scheduled break for the young cast to do their exams. Yates went down well with the regulars. Radcliffe in particular praised Yates' rapport with the cast, telling Entertainment Weekly in 2006, quote, "I don't think that there's been a moment on set this time where I've walked away after a scene and thought I didn't give it my all." All of the adult cast signed up for the remaining sequels too, with Imelda Staunton and Helena Bonham Carter joining the ensemble as well as new villains Dolores Umbridge and Bellatrix Lestrange. So production wrapped 2006, and the film eventually came to cinemas in 2007. Specifically, it came out in July 2007, 10 days ahead of the worldwide publication of Rowling's 7th and final Harry Potter book, Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows. It's the only time in either the cinematic or the publication history that a new Harry Potter book came out in shops, while a new Harry Potter film was playing in cinemas. So understandably, the hype was enormous, even by the standards of this series. And that was reflected in the box office. The worldwide opening figures amounted to $333 million during the first 5 days. That's making back its production budget 2 times over. And by the time it got to the end of its theatrical run, it had done almost $940 million worth of business, which is a great result by anyone's standards. At that time, it was the 9th highest grossing film ever made. However, a few years later, it was widely reported that Warner had somehow lost $167 million on the film, according to their own numbers. In 2010, there was a leaked accounting statement which showed that the film's expenses, which included an astronomical press and advertising budget, had exceeded the overall gross box office income. The industry blog Deadline broke this story and noted that in the wake of the contract renegotiations, it seemed that the spending breakdown included an awful lot of Warner paying itself, whether it was for distribution costs or for advertising fees to its own networks, as if to ensure that the movie didn't make any net profits. And it's a result of chicanery like this that it's accepted nowadays that actors and crew members who are eligible for a back-end deal from a film's box office should always be after a percentage of the gross rather than the net profits. More often than not, studio spreadsheets will contrive to show that for one reason or another there is no net profit. And if that were the case, if that were actually true, then film simply wouldn't be a sustainable industry. That it's going on at this scale, though, and with a film as massive as a Harry Potter sequel, and indeed the most successful Harry Potter film since the first one, shows the audacity of these accounting schemes. There can be no doubt that Order of the Phoenix washed its face, even if you only look at the profits from home media and TV screenings in the decade or so since the film was released. But to conclude, the film is far more important as a transitional chapter in the franchise. Warner was evidently happy enough with what David Yates did on this film that they signed him up to direct the remainder of the series. And while that meant we'd never get to see a Mira Nair Potter film or a Matthew Vaughn Potter film, both of which could have been really interesting, the benefits of Yates' tenure is to provide consistency as an ever more intertwined story moves towards its finale. We know now, of course, that David Yates' stewardship of the cinematic Potterverse has continued on into Rowling's spin-off, Fantastic Beasts and Where to Find Them, and its sequel, The Crimes of Grindelwald. and it seems as if he's going to do the 3 planned films in that franchise as well. That'll bring the final tally for this Wizarding World franchise to 13 films, notwithstanding any other spin-offs that get put into production, but it can easily be argued that we don't get there, we don't get to this level of the Potter franchise continuing without a film as strong as Harry Potter and the Order of the Phoenix to kick it off.